The recording.
Excellent. So we're going to cover a lot of things today. We're going to move pretty quickly. We are going to start off with a fun Kahoot quiz. Hopefully you've got a chance to do that at least one other time today. And then each of us are going to talk about the podcast we did, and we're also going to talk about certain different topics. Rob is going to cover choosing a topic, planning a podcast, and I'm going to talk about tips for recording and publishing, including some technical details. So we're going to start off with our first Kahoot quiz. I'm going to bring that up here. So if you have the Kahoot app on your phone, you're going to want to use this game pin, 2469460. And I'll give a couple of minutes for people to sign in. You can also go, if you have another screen in another browser, you can go to kahoot.it and play from there as well.
Then I think you have to have both screens open at the same time. It makes it easier, right?
Yeah.
Because it's hard to go back
because you're
and
going to
forth.
need to still see this screen. The prompts are going to be on this Zoom screen. I'll give you a minute or two to log in. So if you haven't played Kahoot before, you're going to get some multiple choice questions, and you're going to get points if you get the correct answer, but you get even more points if you're one of the first people to respond. You get more points the faster you respond. We'll give it just one more minute. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. If you aren't quite in yet, you'll still be able to see the participant score and the participant pin in the lower right. And so you'll be able to join late if you want to. Just to introduce the topic of podcasting, we're going to go over some questions. By June of 2018, Apple Podcasts had how many podcast downloads? All right, the answer was 1 billion. It's quite a lot. Looks like Mary S. is in the lead at the moment. According to Edison Research 2019, what percent of Americans have listened to a podcast within the past month? %. So roughly 1/3 of people have listened to a podcast within the past month. According to Edison Research again, what percent of Americans are familiar with the word podcasting? Somewhere between 70 and 80%. All right, the correct answer, that was a tricky one. It's actually 70%. 3 of you got that one right. Question 4. Roughly how many episodes are on the Toastmasters International official podcast? answer, 170. So quite a lot are out there already. And that's the one that's put together by the international organization. This is sort of a math question. If you complete one Pathways level per quarter, how many years would it take to get 2 level 5 awards? I bet you guys didn't know that there was going to be math involved today. All right. Looks like a lot of you got it. 2.5 years. 10 quarters would be 2.5 years. I just think that's something interesting to think about. It's sort of a useful benchmark. So if you do one level every 3 months, you'll be done with 2 level 5s in 2.5 years. Next question. How many paths offer Create a Podcast as an elective? The answer is 11. It's actually present in every single path, and there are now 11 paths. The Create a Podcast project is an elective for which level? It's an elective for level 4. One final question. What is the minimum amount of content needed to complete the Create a Podcast project? So how many minutes of podcast do you have to create? The answer is 60 minutes, and that can be spread across as many episodes as you want. So let's take a look at the leaderboard. Tammy is in third. Joe is in second. Number 1, Mary S. Congratulations, Mary S. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We're going to head back to our presentation. Hopefully that got you thinking about podcasts and what an interesting project this could be. I'm now going to turn over the meeting to Rob, who's going to start off by going over some details about his podcast. Rob, you're still on mute.
Thanks. Go ahead, switch. My podcast name, like as was mentioned in the intro, is Reads for Revolutionaries. It's a review of classic socio-political economic books. I did 2 episodes for the podcast project. One was The Law by Frederick Bastiat. The second was Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. As I mentioned in the podcast, it looks like an awfully long book for one lesson. Anyway, back up, please. The idea, though, was motivated by wanting to help a friend. I have a friend named Jim. been friends with him for about 30 years, and we like to talk about this kind of stuff. And we'll frequently get together, and I'll say, "Hey, I read this in a book," and we'll talk about it some. And he really enjoys talking about those things with me. We enjoy talking together about them. It's just one of the things we do as friends. But Jim doesn't like to read very much. He is an electrical engineer. He's plenty smart, but he tells me at least that he reads everything like it's a technical manual and very slowly, very closely. It just makes reading a bit painful to him. So I thought, well, there's these books. I know he would be interested in these books, but I also know he doesn't like reading. And then I think a lot of people, they're in the car. I mean, pre-COVID at least, they're in the car driving to work 20, 30 minutes a day. Podcasts are an excellent time to get smart about something. So I was thinking about that and really wanted to help my friend Jim in particular. And that was kind of the why behind the what of my podcast. Okay, next slide. My podcast episodes are not published and I put there yet. I'm still planning it, and we'll talk a bit about some of the things that have delayed that. Originally, though, I've told you how that the podcast, what it came to be. Originally, I wanted it to be a book discussion, though, with a friend, actually more than one friend, like one for each book, and have a different friend talk through a book with me. Both of us read it and just talk through the points that we thought were interesting, the points that we thought were applicable for today. And that just didn't happen. Everybody ended up being too busy, to this, to that it just was more than they wanted to do. Finally,
Rob,
yes.
there was a question. Can you define podcast?
Yeah, sure. I think Sam may give a better definition later on, but for my purposes, what a podcast is it is at least an audio presentation. They're usually somewhere between 20 minutes. Some of the longer ones go to 3 hours, but it's a pre-recorded audio presentation on any kind of topic, really. And you can listen to it. I personally listen to mine I've got an Apple iPhone, and there's a podcast app that you can search for podcasts on, again, on all types of topics. And frequently it'd be kind of like there's a channel. Yeah, I would create my channel, say Reads for Revolutionaries, and there would be multiple episodes that would come out, hopefully on periodic intervals, that then people could listen to.
Yeah, I believe the most common services are Apple Podcasts, if you have a smartphone, an Apple smartphone. Also, Google Podcasts is very popular on Android phones. And then there's also an app called Spotify, which works on both platforms. And I'll be talking a little bit about those later.
Cool. Well, I guess it's glad that we got that ground level addressed before we move on, because all this will make a lot more sense with that sort of background. I honestly did my podcast very much the hard way. I made this more difficult than it had to be by a long ways, and I'm going to talk about some of the details of that in my next sections. And just for perspective or context, I think I did the first 3 levels of persuasive influence probably in 3 to 6 months total. So beat the 1 level a quarter that Sam was talking about by quite a bit. But doing the podcast project took me over a year, and there are reasons for that. We'll talk about it here in a minute, but take it from me, you don't have to spend that long on it. I did it the hard way, and I would encourage you to think carefully as you move forward, if you want to do this, about ways that you can make your life easier. All right, so thinking about choosing a topic, how does, I told you a little of people happy. I think about one person in marketing. Sometimes there's a technique called creating a persona, and you take a block of your audience and you boil it down or represent that as one person. So that's a great idea. Think about one of your friends or somebody you know that might like this podcast and what they would want. But really, even broader, think about what does your audience actually want to hear? Some starting point ideas. What are your hobbies? You could talk about one of your hobbies or talk together with a friend about one of your hobbies. What are you an expert at? What's something you'd like to learn about? That also can be the source of a podcast. And in fact, many bloggers or vloggers do things just like that, where they almost chronicle their process of learning something new. And people find that interesting to see somebody else learning something and their discoveries and their oh wow, I didn't know that kind of moments. I would really recommend, though, as you think about your topics, to learn from my mistakes. If your topic just isn't going to work, if it turns out to be way more work as you get into it a little bit than what you want to invest, quit, start again. The slogan there is fail fast. If it's not going to work, better to find out fast rather than 6 months later. In my case, I failed kind of slow. It took me 3 or 4 months just to find out that my friends weren't going to help me out. Well, there were 3 or 4 months burned up on really nothing. The second, and I'm sure most people have heard this, but perfection is the enemy of done. Now, what drove my perfectionism was that I was so super passionate about my topic, I wanted it to be perfect. Not only did I want the episodes to be perfect, but I was thinking not only the 2 episodes I had to do for this podcast, but I was thinking about publishing. I was thinking about 5, 6 episodes in advance and how they were going to go, and really wanted to make it a top-notch production because I was so passionate about the topic. Well, that made things go from what could have been done in a couple of months to being done in over a year. Bottom line, be aware of what you're getting into and be intentional about it. If you think, I want this to be a professional grade podcast, realize that's going to take more time than if you're just trying to bust this out for your level 4 project. So here's some, as you move from, okay, I think I've got my topic. What are my next steps? How do I plan this out? Let's talk through that some. First, you do want to figure out the topics, several topics in advance. That was a good move I made. I might have planned it out a little bit too far, but depending on what you're going to do, if you're going to do, say, 60 minutes for the Toastmaster project, and you know you want each episode to be about 20 minutes long, well, then you need to plan out 3 topics. Line up your guests. Get your guests lined up soon. And again, if it's not working, if you can't get people to commit, if you can't get it scheduled, figure that out fast and pick another topic. This is one of the first things that you want to do if you're going to have guests. A typical episode structure of a podcast, not all of them work this way, but this is typical, is that you'd have some sort of teaser intro, some very brief introduction to the topic that gets people's attention. You'd follow that up with a podcast identification. This is where you say, this is my podcast and here's what it's about. That portion is going to be the same pretty much every episode. A lot of people have background music for that portion of their podcast. I used music from my band Pierce Point, so I have this rock music background to my identification section. This is one of the areas you really want to focus on. It's something people are going to hear every time they listen to your podcast. You'll have your intro, your teaser intro for this episode, but then you'll have this, here's what my podcast and here's what it's about. So you really want to focus on, if you're going to be a perfectionist about any one thing, that's the area to be a perfectionist about. Then you've got the body of your episode, just where you do the bulk of it. And for when you get to be a pro, or if you're thinking about that even now, you want to be thinking about, where would I put advertising or endorsement messages? And you might think, good grief, I'm just doing this for my Toastmasters project. I don't have endorsements or advertising. I have a friend who's got a couple episodes of a podcast out, but because the topics aligned with what he does for a living, the company he works for ended up sponsoring his podcast. So actually, it's his first podcast ever, and he has endorsements and advertising in it. So it's possible. The second aspect of your planning is, am I going to do this kind of interview discussion style? In which case, I need to get my other people lined up, or am I going to do this solo? If you're going to do it an interview style, you want to figure out the questions you want to ask well in advance. Do not freewheel this or just kind of go in with a blank slate and try to ask questions without it planning ahead. Do not do that. That would be, I mean, you might get through it, but it's going to make it a lot harder than it needs to be. In fact, you want to know the question so well that you're able to flow with the answers that the person you're interviewing gives you. So you ask question one and they give you an answer and you realize, you know what, that really ties in, their answer ties in and really leads into question five. Well, that's out of order. That's fine. Go ahead, go with the flow, and that's going to make your podcast a lot more cohesive. And if you do editing at the end, it's going to make that editing a lot easier. And finally, hey, thank your guest. They're doing you a favor by being part of your podcast. Tell them thanks. If you're going to do a solo thing, it's just a long speech. Relax. Toastmasters has taught you how to do this. Plan out your speech. Do it like you would any other long speech. No longer speeches do have a little bit different rhythm than shorter speeches, so be aware of that. But you know how to do this. And then finally, if you do want to publish, especially if you're pretty serious about this and want this not to be something that ends at the end of your project, but something that you would continue on in the future, you want to spend some time to think up a memorable and relevant name, something that's fairly short but catchy and relates. And you want a good logo on those podcast apps. As people are scrolling around for them, one of the first things they're going to see when they select your podcast is your logo. If you are not a graphic designer or don't have those skills, if you don't know any graphic designers, there's a company called fiverr.com, and yeah, that is spelled with 2 R's, where they have online tools where you can design or take templates and make your own design. But they also have the ability to hire freelance graphic designers. You can look at their work, see the recommendations, so on and so forth. And they're really quite reasonable. And it will make your podcast look so much more professional. That's what I have. Sam is going to follow up with his podcast example and give a lot of technical details about how to make this work.
Yeah, and I did want to follow up with some of the questions it looks like we got in the chat. One person did say you want to avoid you want to avoid using any copyrighted music. You don't want to get in trouble for that. And that's some good advice. And one question we got, should you let the guest know the questions in advance? I like to offer them that option. I told my guests I can either give them to you in advance or we can just do it on the fly during the meeting. And there was sometimes I gave it to them in advance and sometimes it was more like table topics. They just gave an impromptu answer. So I wanted to talk about my own podcast. I did mine for my Toastmasters Club. It's called the League of Our Own Toastmasters Club. You can actually search for it in your podcasting apps. So apps like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I'm sure it's out there in several others. I'll talk about how I published them to multiple places at once later on. So mine was different. I think I took a little bit of an easier route. Also, when I thought about podcasts I listened to, I preferred more of the conversational style. So I decided my goal was to create 3 20-minute episodes and complete them by having guests. I would interview people in Toastmasters leadership and create episodes that way. So I had one episode about club level leadership where I interviewed my own president and vice president of education. Then I did an area and division level leadership one where I interviewed the area 10 director and division C director. And sort of my finale, which was the last one, I interviewed District 8 Director RJ. So overall, I think it turned out to be really interesting, and it's something you can go out, you can check that out today if you want to. So just a few quick things, lessons learned from my presentation. I found out that I originally created way too many questions. So all of my episodes ended up ballooning up to about 40 minutes. So I have 3 40-minute episodes out there. If you really want to do about 20 minutes per episode, you probably only need 4 questions if you've got 2 guests. And besides that, you probably want to leave some time for improvised questions. You know, when you're having a conversation with somebody, you're probably naturally going to touch on something that you hadn't thought of ahead of time. So it's nice to leave time for improvised questions. Another thing to talk about, try not to over edit. Similar to what Rob was saying earlier, don't let perfect get in the way of done. And also, I think if you're doing an interview style, if you do too much editing, it no longer sounds like a genuine and sincere conversation. It sounds too polished. So that's my advice, is not to over edit. I wanted to give you some practical tips for recording. So actually, if you look in the project documentation, the Toastmasters International claims the basic tools are just a microphone, a recording device, and recording and editing software. And then some other options, they give some other options if you're doing a different type of podcast. Like you could use a camera for a video podcast. But they don't give you any guidance on software. And so I'm sure they did that because they didn't want to box you in. You have whatever options you want. But I thought I would share how I did it so you at least know one way that you can do it that I thought was pretty effective. So I just used a laptop with a webcam, used that microphone and that camera. And I conducted my interviews over Zoom because that's what my guests were familiar with. And I just used the default recording in Zoom meetings, and that created a video file. Then I used Audacity. Audacity is a free open source software that you can edit audio with, and you can set it up so you can import a video file and it converts it to audio. And that's what I did. And lastly, I took the MP3 file that I got from Audacity and I posted it on Anchor. Anchor is one of a couple different podcast hosting sites. So when you put a podcast on one of those hosting sites, it gradually gets picked up on all the smartphone apps. That's why you can find my podcast on Spotify and Google Podcasts and Apple Podcasts, and probably some of the other options that people mentioned in the chat. Yeah, I didn't specify that they should go to those, but since I have my podcast on Anchor, it's made it to a bunch of different places. So step 1 in the process was to sort of record with Zoom. So when you're using Zoom, you might want to consider, do you need a basic account or a pro account? Well, with a basic account, if you have a meeting with 3 or more people, you only have a 40-minute time limit. And you are able to record meetings, but you can't record to the cloud. So it takes up space on your computer. And that really depends on whether that's an issue for you. If you upgrade to a pro account, that's $15 per month, but it removes some of those limitations. I didn't have enough time to talk about all the intricacies with recording in Zoom, but I think some of you have experienced already. And I would definitely say my number 1 tip, practice recording the meetings by yourself first. Just create a random Zoom meeting, record yourself, make sure you know how it works, make sure you can find the file after you're done recording. And when you have someone come on your podcast and they're going to be your guest, I would prep them before you hit the record button. I often tell them to go ahead and turn off their camera, especially if they're having an issue with their bandwidth, their internet bandwidth. And actually, I find that sometimes that improves the audio quality. I tell them to take their time before editing, before answering. And the reason is I can always eliminate long pauses in the editing software. I tell them we can redo any question. I go over the episode agenda before we start. and I ask them if they have any questions about the process before I hit the record button. I think if you do those things, they'll be more at ease and ready to talk. So step one for me was to record with Zoom, and step two was to edit with the Audacity software. So I've included in this presentation, which you'll get a copy of later, there's a link, the main link to download Audacity. And then there's sort of a complicated second step where you need to download a specific library that allows you to import a video file and turn it into an audio track. So I've included a link from YouTube on how to do that. If you follow that link, it will be a pretty painless process. And just in general, while you're using Audacity, YouTube is your friend. There's a lot of tutorials out there that will teach you how to do things in Audacity. And in fact, what I want to do right now, I'm going to quickly show you Audacity and give you a flavor for some of the things you can do in it. So here I have Audacity, the program. I'm going to open that up. Right now it's a blank program. I'm opening a folder explorer. So I have a couple different Zoom clips. Now the Zoom files are saved as .mp4 files, but as you can see, I can just take it, drag it, drop it. It's created a track here in Audacity. I wanted to talk about just the most basic toolbars. So this is my transport toolbar, and it's got play, pause, stop. Also, you click in here, you can pick where you want to start. This will jump you to the end or back to the beginning. So I can hit the play button and it will play my audio. So that was sort of just a little jingle. I recorded that myself just to use at the beginning and the end of my podcast. So the default tool you have is really the selection tool. What's nice, you can select an entire range, click the delete button, and it's gone. And it shifts everything to the left. So I'm going to do that for these silent portions. The other really useful thing on this tools toolbar is the time shift button. You click that and you can move clips around. And that becomes important once you have multiple tracks in here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to add my interview I did with RJ. I'm going to add that. Once again, I just drag and drop. And here it is. Now, my first track, that shrunk because I added this really long clip. And so it zoomed out automatically. You've got some zoom features here. You can zoom in and zoom out. I'm going to zoom back in. And I'm going to say, oh, I need my selection tool again. This is all not this is not talking. So I'm just going to delete this. Now these two clips are overlapping, and maybe I don't want that. So I can click here to the time shift tool. I'm going to move it over again. Now this clip happens before this clip. The last thing I wanted to show, let's say I want to use this clip again at the end of the episode. I can go back to my selection tool. I'm going to select this whole thing. There's a cut, copy, and paste up here. I'm going to click copy. I'm going to go to the very end, click here, and click on paste. And I can move it into the correct place with this time shift tool again. So now that's just a couple of the very basic things you can do in here. Hopefully you found that helpful. And then once you're satisfied with it, I would probably do a lot more editing to this, but let's say if I was satisfied with it, I could click File, and I could go to Export, export as MP3, and then I'm basically done. If you're not happy with it or you're still working on it, it's a work in progress, you can just save the project and come back to it later. So that's under here as Save Project. And I've included in this presentation, which you can have a copy later, some of the screenshots from what we've talked about already. So you can refer back to this presentation later. So we talked about tracks, dragging and dropping, moving them around. We talked about 3 of the basic toolbars and the most important functions. So to summarize my technical tips, again, I'm using Zoom to create video MP4 files. I take those, bring them into Audacity, do a little bit of editing, and then I export as MP3s. So the third step is to actually publish what you've created. And I used anchor.fm. That's one of the hosting websites. There are other options out there. But Anchor FM, it's a website. It's also a smartphone app. And then if you put your podcast there, it'll get picked up by the various podcasting services. Once again, it's no cost. You sign up with just an email. You can upload within minutes. And I do see there's a little bit of a lag between when you put it on Anchor FM and when it's searchable on all the podcasting apps. And that's only about 10 days, though. So there's a lot more to explore that I didn't talk about. So I'm not a professional podcaster or a sound engineer. So there's a lot of things that I didn't talk about. Toastmasters does allow you to do a video podcast where you could upload to YouTube or something like that. Audacity has a lot of sound quality editing things you can do. Today, we really only talked about cutting things out, moving things around, but there's a lot more that you can do with Audacity. You can also record within Audacity or Anchor. You don't have to record meetings via Zoom. That's just the way I did it. You could record directly in Audacity or Anchor. Anchor has a smartphone app, which has a lot of interesting options in it. There's also the ability to monetize with Anchor FM. I believe they will try to find advertisers for you. But I chose not to do that for my particular podcast just because mine was associated with our Toastmasters club, and Toastmasters is non-profit. So I wasn't sure that would be appropriate in my case. And I'm sure there's also a lot of other stuff that I didn't even think of. So, of course, you don't know what you don't know. So I'm sure this is a very deep topic, and there's a lot you can do here, but we're just giving you an introduction of some good things to think about. We were going to do another Kahoot. Actually, what I think is more important in the interest of time, I think I'd like to skip ahead to the question and answer session so we can hear some of your questions. Tom, do we have any questions?
I just to let you know, I did load the PowerPoint on the files that you shared with everybody. If they go to the chat, they can see it and download it.
All right. So our presentation is included there. You'll be able to see the screenshots I created and also the links. So that will be a helpful resource. So somebody did make the comment, the reason for the delay between when you put your podcast on a hosting site and when it appears in all the podcasting apps, that actually has something to do with a lot of those podcasting sites. They want to do some sort of screening on your podcast, make sure there's nothing obscene on it, and then they'll post it.
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you for the presentation, guys. I have used Audacity for a couple of different reasons, but when I did my podcast, it was, back in the late 1900s. But I was trying to. I just recently did another audiobook that I produced and narrated. I want to know and Audacity, I literally hired someone to do the editing in Audacity. It's still very user friendly. However, I didn't find their help topics helpful. And so I was wondering, how did you acquire the knowledge about how to manipulate and maneuver? Because there's so many things that are out there. And I went through ACX, Amazon Creative Exchange, and they have certain parameters and sound beds and boards, and I was just crazy. So can you
Yeah.
expound on how you got the information or the knowledge?
So I would say the number one thing I did was search for tutorials on YouTube. I looked for sort of, beginner tips for Audacity and things like that. And also, if you have in mind a specific thing you want to be able to do, like a specific function, you can just type that into YouTube, and most likely someone's talked about that. Like, for example, I specifically searched for how do you get a Zoom video into Audacity, and that's how I came up with that one link that showed me, okay, you need to download an extra piece of software, and then it allows you to drag and drop those files.
I have two questions. Audacity is audio only, is that correct?
That is correct. So I was able to
Oh, wait.
import a video file, but then it immediately is converted to just audio only.
Oh, okay. Are podcasts audio only then?
So podcasts are traditionally audio only.
Okay.
The majority of podcasts are audio only. The Toastmasters project says you can create a video podcast, and you could put a video podcast on something like YouTube, and that still satisfies the Toastmasters requirement. But I think traditionally podcasts have been considered
Okay.
audio only.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I think somebody asked if you could do, if they had to be broken up into episodes, or you could do one long episode. I think you can. You could do one 60-minute episode. And also, I think there's actually a minimum requirement time in there. So I think each episode has to be at least 10 minutes. You might need to check the documentation on that one. But like I said before, like we talked about in the quiz, it's a level 4 project, and you could go in there and take a look at it. But it tells you need 60 minutes of content, and there's a minimum time per episode, I believe.
I'm going to ask if there's a maximum length.
Of import to Audacity.
Oh, that I don't know. I don't know if there's a maximum length to be imported to Audacity. Like I said, my episodes, probably in their unedited form, they were probably at least 45 minutes, and I did not have a problem bringing those into Audacity.
How long did it take you to kind of get your learning curve from start to finish with this? Because I know I go in and I expect, oh, this should be easy. And I expect maybe, just get on and do it. So how long was your learning curve? Because when I find out, oh, it does take a while, but it's doable. Do you know what I mean? And I know everybody's learning curve is a little different, but just to kind of get a general idea. Well, because like everybody says, writing a book, you don't just sit down and write a book and publish it the next day unless you've done it several times and failed, because you learn as you go and you do all that. So just what did you guys go through with that?
I think I got pretty lucky. I don't think it took me that long I think the biggest struggle for me was I think the worst part is trying to figure out what software to use since it's not actually talked about in the manual. Um, but I knew a lot of people who knew how to use Zoom, so I picked that up pretty quickly. And then I talked to uh, somebody at my former company. I asked him, okay, I know our company publishes podcasts. What do you do to edit podcasts? And he talked about Audacity. So that's where I learned about Audacity. And that probably had the longest learning curve out of all the tools I used. So I did have to, I would say that probably took, I probably spent a few hours on that, just watching YouTube videos and then experimenting with myself. That was the longest part of the learning curve for me. And then actually, I, I, when I found about Anchored FM, I think the learning curve on that is extremely small. It's pretty much as simple as uh, creating descriptions and images for your podcast and uploading a file. So that part wasn't too bad at all. But Audacity is definitely the trickiest part, especially if you've never used audio editing software before. I think Rob, I don't think he used Audacity, but he used some other sort of audio editing software that he was already familiar with. Rob, can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Because I'm a musician, I've done a lot of recording over the years. I already have Pro Tools and Steinberg's Cubase, which are both digital recording packages used really widely in the music industry. So it's kind of like a not fair thing. I came in knowing how to do that, and I've accumulated knowledge over the years in how to do that and how different sound effects are going to affect things. And so that's kind of not fair. But I guess one thing I would say is if you're just looking to do a podcast to meet the requirements of the Toastmasters project, what he's shown you is how to drag and drop and then kind of slice the pieces up and put the pieces where you want them to. And that's your most critical matter is when somebody says, oh, I just blew that question. I want to start again. How to take that section that they said they just blew and select it, like you said, cut it out. I mean, those are that's some of the biggest things I did as I was editing is just that, ooh, I've got like a 15-second pause there where I was skipping from one thing to another. I don't want that 15-second pause to be in the final output. So I'm going to select that part and remove it. So I really think you can get the basics pretty quickly. And if it were me trying to do this just for the podcast project, I would do exactly what Sam said. It's free. It looks like it does a great job, and it makes the basics very easy to do of what you're trying to do. Now, what I would say is if you are really interested in doing a top-notch professional grade project, you could go to a recording studio and have an engineer there correct mix whatever your stuff, or you could give them the basic path where you've edited out all your dead silence and your missed speeches and this, that, and the other, and you give them the basics, and then they could really polish that up. It's going to cost you some money, but the result would be better, but it's completely unneeded for this project.
So it sounds like this project should just be something we do to get familiar with it, get better at it, so that when we do want to do something more professional, we have some experience and we know what we're doing. Kind of like everything else with Toastmasters, including how to Zoom and everything else. So, okay. Thank you very much for the presentation today, gentlemen.
Totally welcome.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, it is now 3:20 p.m. We thank both our presenters for an excellent presentation. A podcast of this will be on the Toastmaster. No, we're not going to do a podcast. A video cast will be on the Toastmaster website. If you go to the YouTube site, you'll be there hopefully by tomorrow, and you'll see that. I did post the file on the chat if you're interested in pulling the actual documents. So we thank you, and in 9 minutes, we will begin.